Let's continue our discussion of the senses by talking about the two special senses that are localized to our inner ear, hearing and balance, sometimes called equilibrium. So we're going to identify the structures of the ear and their functions, detail sound localization, explain the functions of the spiral organ of Corti in our inner ear, talk about hearing loss and deafness, and describe how the equilibrium organs help us maintain our balance. So first, in order to understand hearing, we have to understand sound. And for this, we're going to get into a little bit of physics. I apologize in advance. So sound is a wave function, and it's moving through space, and eventually it will be picked up by your ears. And sound has two different components to it. So frequency, or how close together those waves are, determine if it's a high-pitched sound or a low-pitched sound. So high-pitched noises, the sound waves are very close together, whereas low-pitched noises, the sound waves are very far apart, okay? Or it's got a long wavelength is another way of thinking about it. Frequency is inversely proportional to wavelength. The other thing we need to think about is amplitude or volume. So if we have a high amplitude, we're going to have a very loud noise. A very small amplitude, we're going to have a very soft noise. And both of those pieces of information, both frequency and amplitude, will tell us about the sound and will code for what kind of sound we're hearing. Our ear houses two senses. It houses hearing and balance or equilibrium. And it's divided into three sections: the outer ear, the middle ear called our tympanic cavity, and the inner ear, which is the bony labyrinth. And this is the picture we're going to come back to over and over again. We have our outer ear composed of the auricle and the external acoustic meatus ending in our tympanic membrane. And then we have that middle tympanic cavity enclosed by our tympanic membrane and the oval window. And this has our three ossicles. And then we have our inner ear, which is our bony labyrinth. The outer ear and the middle ear, those are full of air, and the inner ear is full of fluid. Let's start by talking about our external ear. So this is involved only with the sense of hearing, and it starts with the auricle, and then it links to an external acoustic meatus, sometimes called an auditory canal. And what the main function of the auricles, and this function has slightly been lost through evolution, but the main function is to kind of funnel in those sound waves. So we've got this lovely shape here, and the waves are going to come from all directions, and they're going to be funneled in through the auricle and travel down the auditory canal. And that auditory canal is lined with skin and ceruminous glands or wax glands, and it ends in a tympanic membrane. Now, why do we have two ears? So we have this ear structure here to help us funnel in the sound, and we have two ears to help us figure out where that sound is coming from for sound localization. And so what your brain does is it calculates the difference between when sound arrives at one ear versus when it arrives at another ear to help figure out where that sound is coming from. And it calculates this horizontal angle, and there's also a little bit of loss of volume that will tell you about the distance. And so your brain will use those cues, those binaural cues, two ears, oral, auditory, hearing, to help figure out where sound is coming from. Now, the middle ear, the tympanic cavity, again, it's an air-filled cavity in our temporal bone here, and it's also involved only with the sense of hearing. It's located between that tympanic membrane and our oval and round windows. And this is where we're going to have our pharyngotympanic or tube come in. It's also sometimes called the auditory tube. It's also sometimes called the eustachian tube. So this tube has lots of names. And what it does is it relieves the pressure in this middle ear. So you can see that it's an air-filled cavity, and it actually is kind of a closed system. And so if pressure starts to build on the outside ear or decrease in the outside ear, there can be a pressure difference between what's going on in the world and what's happening in your middle ear. So for example, you're going up in an airplane. The pressure starts to fall, even though you are in a pressurized cabin, it falls a little bit because you're climbing up. And now there's a difference between the pressure in your outer ear on one side of the tympanic membrane and your inner ear on the other. And that tympanic membrane can start to bulge, and that causes a lot of pain. And so to relieve that pressure, to equalize them again, you need to open up your pharyngotympanic tube because normally it's closed. And so you do this by yawning or swallowing. This is why when you're on an airplane, you want to chew gum or something to help you open up that tube relieve the pressure. Now, this tube in children is actually more horizontal and small, and so that's why kids have a harder time equalizing the pressure in their ears. It's also more likely to fill up with fluid. So if you hear a screaming kid on an airplane, it's not their fault. Be nice to them. Okay, the main purpose of our tympanic cavity is to house these ossicles, which are the smallest bones in your body, the malleus, ingus, and stapes. Miss is what you can remember it by. And the function here is to increase the strength of our wave function. So the middle ear is where we get ready to enter the inner ear, which is full of fluid. And what happens to a sound wave when it enters fluid? Think about when you jump into a swimming pool or a lake, right? Sound kind of gets muffled. It's harder for waves to travel in a liquid. And so to prepare our sound waves for the liquid of the inner ear, we need to strengthen them. And the ossicles do that in the same way that when you push a kid on a swing, you're strengthening their wave function of movement. We are lining up the movement here so the ossicles will start to move and they will strengthen the wave function so that it will move from the tympanic membrane through the ossicles to the oval window of our inner ear, and the function will be stronger and ready to enter the liquid. So take a minute and pause this video and see if you can explain how sound travels through the external and middle ear. So now we're in where all the action happens, our inner ear. And again, this has organs for balance and hearing. And we have a maze of bony chambers in our temporal bone, and we'll talk about the cochlea, the vestibule, and the semicircular canals. The cochlea looks like a little shell here. The semicircular canals look like little horseshoes. And the vestibule is just this region here in the middle. And we've got here a membranous labyrinth suspended in perilymph. So just think about it as a fluid-filled bone. Inside, we have the spiral organ of Porty, which is located in that cochlear duct. And it has the receptors for sound, which are little hair cells on a basilar membrane. And above it, we've got a gel-like tectoral membrane, which is going to bend the hair cells. And the hair cells have mechanoreceptors, and so when they bend or they move, they are going to fire an action potential. And that action potential will travel up our vestibular cochlear nerve and go to our auditory cortex in our temporal lobe for processing. So this is that picture again. We've got our basilar membrane. We've got these hair cells with the mechanoreceptors. We've got this gel-like tectoral membrane that's going to move and bend the hair cells and send that action potential down, forming our cochlear nerve, which will join up to form our vestibular cochlear nerve. Again, the vibrations from the sound wave will move that tectoral membrane, the hairs will bend, and then we'll have an action potential that will go brainstem, auditory pathway, auditory cortex. Now, what do we mean when we say mechanoreceptor? So there is actually a connection between each of the hair cells. And when one hair moves, it actually will open up, it will pull open the receptor, the mechanogated receptor here on the adjacent hair cell. And so that opening will allow cations to flow and depolarize that hair cell, starting an action potential. So movement is what gates this type of channel. Now, that's how we hear. Remember I told you there were two pieces of information we need to encode for. We need to encode for volume and we need to encode for frequency. Volume will be encoded based on the duration of the signal. So loud noises will bend the hairs for longer than very quiet noises. And so we'll fire off more action potentials from our hair cells. So more action potentials, more frequent action potentials from that hair will encode volume. Now, frequency is encoded in a slightly different way, a little bit more complicated. And that's based on the location of the hair cell. So high-pitched noises will disturb the short fibers of the basilar membrane really close to the oval window, and low-pitched noises will bend the long, floppy fibers further away. And so this is what that looks like. So if we're close to the oval window, we've got short fibers for our high-pitched noises, and further down, we've got long fibers for our low-pitched noises. Okay, take a minute and explain what the inner ear does, and think about how we encode volume and pitch.